Thank you very much both for joining us. I thought it'd be a good idea to talk about EV charging, the EV market, but also the role of road revenues in the UK, which are existent in segmented shape and forms, but not really. Charged Up is a title that I've put in particularly to challenge a little bit both of you about what you think about your respective sectors. But before we start, I think it'd be useful if you could introduce yourselves. Maybe we could go with Tim first.
Sure. So I'm Tim Ray, Sales Director for UK and Ireland for Capsh. For those that don't know, Capsh are most widely known as a tolling company. We're around about 3/4 tolling and around about 1/4 traffic management. However, that is somewhat different in the UK because there's not so much tolling in the UK. So we're most widely known in the UK for two things, really. We provide all of the traffic management systems for national highways, formerly Highways England. That means that all of the gantry control, etc., that you see when you're driving down the motorway, that's driven by our back office system. So that's a really big project for us. And we also provide, perhaps more relevantly to this discussion today, we also provide the significant proportion of the back office system. Again, we're all like back office systems really, but yeah, the back office system for the ULEZ system in London, the one that's somewhat controversial. So perhaps we'll have some controversial chats about that today.
Thank you very much, Tim. Alex?
Yeah, hi. I'm Alex Callan, the Managing Director of UK and Ireland for Blink Charging. Blink Charging, a little bit like Tim said, for those who don't know, Blink Charging is a NASDAQ-listed EV charging business with a very big presence in the US and then also through a number of markets in Europe and in the UK as well. As a business, we're a charge point operator, a CPO. So primarily, although we do a number of other activities, primarily we operate particularly public chargers, and that means we design, install and operate, and where possible Blink prefers to own the infrastructure as well. So we have chargers throughout the UK and Ireland, sometimes operating under our own ownership and sometimes for our host, our partners as well.
Thank you very much. As a way of a bit of an overview of both of your sectors, I shall float a bit of information which should set us up for quite an interesting discussion. If something I say is not correct, please feel free to correct me throughout the conversation. So, as it stands today, we've got around 75,000 public EV charging points in the UK, which are supposed to contribute around 16 billion to the UK gross added value by 2035, creating 10,000 jobs in the EV charging sector and additionally 16,000 jobs in the manufacturing sector. The government has currently committed to investing 2.3 billion to support EV transition, aiming to facilitate industry growth and job creation, with an announcement as of yesterday by the Minister for Transport, Lillian Greenwood, about scrapping planning applications for homes as well as businesses to encourage the adoption of EV charging, which I'd like to talk about, if that's okay. When it comes to road revenue, so anything from tolling or the versions of it that Tim can talk to a bit later, there isn't much happening. It doesn't look like it's a very sexy part of the transport industry. But having said that, one of the biggest revenue contributions to the HMT, circa 24.4 billion, is from fuel duties, which is 0.8% of the national income, with a declining trend, some of which is contributed to the adaptation and stimulation of EV. Now, talking about the current landscape of EV and road charging regulation, in no particular order, maybe starting with Alex, what are the most significant recent regulatory changes affecting EV charging and the EV charging infrastructure in the UK in light of what I've just shared and yesterday's announcement? And then Tim, if you can come in starting straight from ULEZ, is this good or bad in terms of regulation? Alex.
So I think depends what your definition of recent is, but over the last few years, I think the big changes have been the introduction of the public charge point regulations, which was very much based around the alternative fuels infrastructure regulations, European legislation, and that's very much trying to set some clear standards for public charging infrastructure, covering a range of features. So that's standardizing payments, ensuring we've got contactless payments available. That's looking at reliability of these public assets. And so it's very much starting to drive the standards in the industry. I think there are a number of other regulations working their way through. You obviously heard an update on the progress through of the planning bill. I think the charging infrastructure is street furniture, and so falls within the scope of a lot of other legislations that govern how we install and how we manage the infrastructure on the street. But a lot of that was written before we were considering installing or trying to install 300,000 chargers on the street as well. So some of that requires some adaptation. And I think particularly there's quite a bit of work being done at the moment to streamline and, where possible, remove some of the costs associated with installing charging infrastructure. That is probably one of the bigger barriers affecting this industry is any time you're adding cost to what is already a fairly challenging business case, you're going to dampen investment interest into that as well. So I think some of the activities recently in terms of starting to try to streamline, remove some of the permits and the licenses, or make easier access for charge point operators have been very good signs. And I think whilst it's not directly targeting the charging infrastructure, it is incredibly important, is the ZEV mandate, the zero emission vehicle mandate. Obviously, we are the supply part, if you like, of the industry in the charging side. We need the demand part, which is the vehicles, to also come hand in hand with that as well. And I know that's been there's been a lot of what should we say, sort of some have been very much in favour and some have been very much against the ZEV mandate. I think if you look at the success it has had at the moment, we're seeing percentage of new vehicles sold routinely above 20% and of fully electric vehicles, and that's obviously starting to create demand for charging infrastructure, and that is essential to underpin investment required to get us through to 2030.
Thank you. I think that balancing policy is always a tricky topic there. Too many interests, especially when it comes to environmental protection and the zero emission mandate of the previous government and the current government. Before I hand to Tim to talk a little bit about regulation in his sector, and let's have ULEZ as an example, do you think that the move and the announcement as of yesterday is positive for the citizens of the UK and also businesses? And do you think that would encourage further investment into EV charging and the uptake of EV vehicles?
Yeah, I think it is. I think it is a positive move towards this. I think, we've got this target of 300,000 public chargers by 2030. As you said, we've gone past the 75,000, almost to the 80,000 mark. We need to be installing around about 3,500 a month, and we're currently, the numbers vary month to month, but we're kind of averaging around the 3,000 a month. And so we need to go, we're going fairly well, but we need to go a bit quicker. And so I think moves like simplifying the planning applications help us in very much as an industry and moving through that. And there's a lot of work as an industry, particularly through the likes of Charge UK, to really push work with government to further streamline this and allow us to accelerate. Because there's a lot of progress being made, but we do still need to go faster. If you've got 20% of new vehicles each month rolling onto the road that are electric, they need somewhere to charge. And people often talk about chicken or egg, which one's going to come first. It absolutely has to be the charging infrastructure to give people confidence to move into an electric vehicle.
Thank you. Tim, regulation in your sector, positive, negative?
Yeah, what I would say is that the EV charging regulation clearly isn't my sweet spot, but I do watch from afar because it has influence on our side. And what I would say is that I had absolutely no idea when these planning changes were were introduced, how far-reaching they would be. I think about planning, I think about more houses, but when you start talking about the kind of stuff that Alex has mentioned, I just find that absolutely fascinating and really far-reaching. I mean, you know, from a regulation point of view, from our side, from a tolling side, there is little change, is the simple answer. However, one point I'd just like to make is that the thing with electricity is, in comparison to fuel, it's very difficult to know where it's come from. So whether it's come out of a plug from your home or whether it's come out of one of Alex's chargers, it is near impossible to distinguish between those things from a tolling point of view. So, as in comparison to fuel duty, for example. So it's probably not practical to introduce taxation or any sort of means of payment in relation to keeping the roads moving at the EV pump, if you like. So I do think a more nuanced solution is needed. And the introduction of EV, and I'm sure we'll come on to talk about this many times, introduces great opportunity in the tolling industry. EVs are fundamentally different at how they are powered. They are fundamentally different in terms of their connected ability. So I do think now is the time. Guess what? I would say that, but I do think now is the time to say, if we're going to make a fundamental change to address the problems that we have, a more nuanced, a more specific, a more technology-driven tolling solution would be the way forward.
Thank you very much. You have both touched on a couple of points that I would like to discuss. And if you don't mind, I'll switch this up a little bit. So we talked about how fast, how rapid, and the fact that even EV charging regulation, in your case, Tim, has opportunities and barriers as well to your industry. You touched upon something that I think is a minefield, which is electricity and the grid, and you touched on it very, very gently. Please go as much into the topic as you want, but how do you see an opportunity of collaboration, especially from a regulatory perspective? And I'm not suggesting that there should be the same regulation, so that the EV charging agenda marries with smart cities, smart transportation, dynamic pricing on roads, or anything that you're thinking about from a leadership perspective in your sector. And then secondly, how important is the grid support to both support your strategy as a business, but also the deployment of EV charging at that rapid pace? Alex, and please come in as a discussion between the two of you.
Well, I think I'll let Alex comment on how many power stations we need to keep EV chargers going, because that's perhaps not my sweet spot. But what I would say in terms of tolling systems, or perhaps nicer terms such as pay as you drive, and these softer terms that I think are perhaps a little bit more politically acceptable. There are many examples of tolling systems being used to influence customer behaviour. As we introduce more complex systems, these allow us to have more focus on what we're actually trying to achieve. So at the moment, we have a very brutal system. So I have a diesel car. Perhaps shouldn't admit to that, should I? But I have a diesel car, and I pay whatever it is, £250 a year, entirely irrespective of how far I drive, and that cannot be seen. So the nice thing about the topic that I tend to focus on is that people tend to get it. That people know that the guy that drives 1 million miles a year should pay more than the guy that drives 10 miles a year. So it's not a politically sensitive thing, But in terms of goals, tolling systems can be adapted to achieve political goals. So, for example, if your goal is to reduce emissions, we can price for that. We can charge for that. And of course, what we know is that pricing and charging influences customer behavior like no other, in a positive way. If your goal is to reduce congestion, we can charge for that. So at the moment, the fuel that's gone into your enormous supercar, which is driving down Oxford Street at 9 o'clock on a Monday morning, causing lots of congestion, causing lots of air quality problems, that is priced in exactly the same way as that same supercar driving through an empty field at 4 o'clock on a Wednesday morning, so there is no distinguishing between the two, and that's not fair, and people get that that's not fair, and that's why you see the somewhat perverse behaviours that you see, in so much as people aren't incentivized to shift to public transport, for example, because there is no financial incentive to do that. If there was a more nuanced charging system for the roads, whether that be road user charging or whatever it might be, that would allow should I say, the politicians to have the levers to pull to say, vote for me and I will get congestion out of the streets of Leeds. That would create levers for them to pull to say, right, that's how I'm going to actually do it, rather than just asking nicely, if you like. Alex, I don't know if you can sort of relate to any of that.
Alex, go for it.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, and you did say it would be good to get some level of disagreement with us. I will disagree with one point that Tim said, but then make up again by agreeing with a lot of the rest of it. Was, I think you said in terms of it's difficult, whereas the fuel we can measure where it's come from at the pump. We can do the same on the electricity side as well now. So I say from a technical side, obviously, when we are required, there's a standard that the meter that goes into the charger has to meet to allow us to be able to bill against that. And that includes equally, Blink does quite a lot of charges on lampposts, and those lampposts don't have their own meters, and so you have to have a particular you have to meet an Elexon approval to allow you to be able to then charge someone, because you've sufficiently accurately measured the electricity flowing through that meter. That being said, just because we can measure it, that's my disagreement piece. The agreement piece is I'm not sure necessarily we should do, because I do then very much agree with what Tim said, is there is a big difference in where you then drive your vehicle, where and when you then drive your vehicle. And I also agree, and I think this is where if I tie back to your question on the grid, agreeing with what Tim said there, which is actually we have seen lots of information about being able to encourage behaviors or trends that you want to see with pricing strategies. And we see this on with electric vehicles. There are a number of fairly innovative energy companies starting to price in the off-peak charging, which, for many of us, that meant you put your dishwasher or your washing machine to come on a 4-hour delay that kicks in the off-peak time. What you now see, the slightly smarter, a little bit more dynamic approach in EV charging is when I get home, I plug my car in. It will start a very brief charge to establish the connection, literally seconds, and then it will probably pause it. And then what it will do is it will kick in at various times at which when the energy price is cheapest to charge through the night. And it's a one-time setup. So I simply say my car has to be charged and ready to go by 6 o'clock in the morning. And what it does then is ensure that it will, and sometimes, I think it was 2 or 3 nights ago, it stopped 2 or 3 times through the night, because there's a brief pause as prices possibly climb again, but there's sufficient time after that. And so it takes a bit of getting used to, in terms of, used to, if you need to charge your phone up, you plug it in because I want it charged now because I want to use it. My car, I plug it in and I trust that the third party is going to then charge that for me. Once you've gone past that initial thing of waking up the next morning, am I able to drive into work? Actually, it becomes incredibly normal and incredibly easy. And I think that, again, there is a pricing incentive. It's 25% of the price to charge overnight than it is to charge during the day, which again makes a very material difference to that as well.
I absolutely love that technology. It's if I can pivot to a very quick analogy, I used to work in the railways, and the railways were always about, more trains, faster trains, get people through the train stations quicker, increase capacity for 1 hour a day. And that was at 8:30 till 9:30. So, Waterloo would sit there nearly empty for the most of the time, but it would be this huge piece of infrastructure. You can absolutely relate that to the grid as well. And the fantastic technology that Alex is referring to there is great. And I guess, Alex, perhaps, you might agree that the great thing about EV cars is usage is relatively predictable, i.e., you're pretty sure you're not going to jump in your car at 3 o'clock in the morning when you plug it in when you go to bed. It's a great advantage from a grid point of view to even out demand. We can be charging all these relatively energy heavy vehicles when nobody's got the kettle on. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. I think that's one of those things people often talk about. Difficult to predict. Actually, as humans, we're creatures of habit, right? And we have a relative, even sure, some of those habits may have shifted slightly post COVID, but again, we settle back into a new normal there as well. And you're right. The driving habits for many people have not really shifted, and they've not shifted that significantly. We might spend more days working at home than driving in to the office. But I think one of those interesting pieces, and this has been one of those challenges, I think possibly similar to what you were saying there, Tim, in terms of people tend to get it, albeit there's a difference between getting it and then being able to implement it, is how far do you need the average battery to let you drive? And for most people, it's 500 miles, 300 miles, 400 miles, 500 miles. And so when the cars were sort of averaging 100, 150, people's views, it's never going to be enough to do that. And yet, actually, if you can drive 150 miles, that's, for me, just north of London, driving to Birmingham. And most days I don't do that. Very, very rarely will I go and do that. And the idea that I want to go to there and then turn around and come straight back again without some sort of pause in the middle, that also doesn't happen. And that is true for the vast majority of people. So it lets you move a lot of the market there. That being said, again, that's always the hard part. I think, like you said, that Tim, is people get I should pay to drive my supercar down through congestion in the big busy high street. It's hard, I think, getting people over the line.
For the avoidance of doubt, I don't own a supercar. Unfortunately.
Some very, very interesting points that I would love to unpack, but I think we should go into some of the topics that you discussed around environmental impact and sustainability. But before that, what I hear from both of you are some great pointers towards a bit more education in your respective sectors about what's positive and what might be negative, which we haven't touched on. But also what I heard a lot of is behavioral changes and cultural changes that are not just about what politicians regulate, but how people behave and how much they understand their own impact and why they should pay for the usage of roads, different prices for when they charge their EV electrical vehicle, which even I sometimes protest against when I travel in France, for example, and there is a maintenance on the road, but I'm still expected to pay the tolling charge that I pay. I get the bigger picture, but I think that there is an educational piece missing here. Three things that you agreed on from a principal perspective were that accessibility, inclusion, and fairness are hugely important, and these are meeting points in both of your sectors. Tim, one idea that I think you should put forward to the government is charge transportation and road usage as personal income tax model. Let's see how that would fly. Because that, it sounded like it could be tiered. There'll be problems with that. So you should probably back your idea with some stats. And I'm sure there are plenty of that. Having said that, do you want to make any additional comments on this, or can we move on to talk about the environment?
Well, no, I think we can move on. Yeah.
Great. So we have touched upon batteries, electricity as an alternative to fuel and all of that. We obviously have a net zero agenda in the UK, in Europe, and more generally internationally. The US has given a very strong indication that that's not how they view the world at the moment. how is all of that global move both towards net zero and then not so much towards net zero from one of the biggest economies in the world affecting your strategy, and how do you think that's affecting uptake both on EV charging but also thinking about a different way of charging roads, congestion, and all of that? You did talk a lot about the benefits to the environment, Tim. Either of you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a road user charging guy, and rule one of road user charging is it's a little bit like an escape room. We aren't allowed to talk about road user charging. Nobody's allowed to leave the building until you've talked about ULEZ in London. That is absolutely mandatory. See, all roads always lead back to the ULEZ system in London. So perhaps I should give a little bit of an insight into that. Yeah, I mean, clearly, I've lived and breathed the ULEZ system. In many ways, it's a very simple system. What you essentially have, London's conveniently a very nice donut shape, isn't it? And what you essentially have is a ring of steel around London. And what I mean by that is 4,500 cameras. We're not involved in the cameras, by the way, just for the avoidance of doubt, but 4,500 cameras, and it's a little bit like a castle. You can come into London, but it will cost you. It'll cost you a flat fee, and once you're in London, you can do what the hell you like. You can do it. You can go in and out as much as you can. You can spend 1 minute, or you can spend 23 hours 59 minutes in there if you so wish. The most significant thing about London, though, I would say, is its scale. We're talking about millions and millions and millions of images being captured a day. And if you think about the role that Cap's taking, that those images are taken, and it is essentially a huge filtration system. So many, many millions of images are pictures of cars. Pictures of cars are great, but they're not something that can be charged against, of course. So pictures of cars go through a great big long convoluted process to say, yes, Tim, you should pay on that day for that journey. And by the way, we're not going to charge you twice. We're not going to charge you the next day because we know you'd left, etc., etc. So getting that right, and of all of the things that you can say about the ULEZ system in London, we tend to get it right. You don't have too many stories of I can't believe you charged me wrongly. That said, there are a huge amount of lessons learned to come away from that. If you think about the history of ULEZ in London, it started out, if you remember, in Westminster as a congestion charge. Congestion charge is great. Everybody gets it. Everybody walks down Oxford Street, sees a line of cars as long as your arm, and thinks, it'd be much nicer if that wasn't the case. Those people should be paying to come in here because there's far too many of them. People got it. So Ken Livingstone at the time introduced congestion zone charge, and people got it, and they could feel the impact. Most importantly, they could feel the impact. They look over the right shoulder and they see no cars, whereas the day before the congestion zone came in, they saw lots of cars. So people got it. And then something very subtle had happened. Two things happened. One, it got wider, it got bigger, and I get that, that's not particularly relevant, I guess, but it also its goals shifted. And its goal shifted away from congestion to air quality improvements. Now, the interesting thing about air quality improvements is, just like congestion, it's not politically sensitive, is it? Nobody stands up and says, vote for me, I'll increase congestion. Nobody does the same, vote for me, and I'll make the air that you breathe terrible. So it's not a controversial thing. However, the big nuanced part of that is you can see congestion and you can't see air quality problems. Broadly, with the exception of smog and all that good stuff. So then we had the interesting dilemma, which was we're now trying to incentivize for air quality improvements, and then you start to think about what actually impacts air quality. So if we go through a very simple process, what impacts air quality? Cars. What type of cars? Polluting cars. If you have to define what polluting cars are in a broad sense, old cars. Who owns old cars? The more economically challenged. And it's very easy to go down that path and end up at a place which is a tax on poor people. And that's where we ended up, from a place which is of every best intention you can possibly imagine. And these are the kind of things that we need to take as a lessons learned if we are to expand the ULEZ system out geographically and to its scope and to its objectives. These are the cool lessons learned. But as the mayor has pointed out recently, another slightly inconvenient truth is it's worked, because the air quality has measurably improved within London. But people can't feel it, and that's the challenge. People is a little bit like the disaster that you that you averted, you never knew was coming in the first place. So that's the kind of challenge, and that's the way in which we will push the political message in the coming weeks, months, and years. Which is, these are the goals and these are the things that we're achieving. But yeah, that's kind of London in a nutshell. And in answer to the environmental question that you originally asked, it worked.
So thank you very much for breaking this down. That's very, very interesting. And you're right that we all feel very differently about ULEZ. And we often say it's a tax. It's tax, especially on the people that can't afford it. Wouldn't you say that then the EV industry would play a crucial positive role in making air quality better, but also potentially resolving some of the challenges around it being a tax on the poor, although I hear that EV cars cost quite a lot of money. And secondly, you said it's worked, and you talked about dynamic pricing earlier, and talking about, we can, instead of charging someone a flat fee of £25, I think it was last time I checked, for ULEZ, could we not do this by the hour? Then that does not prevent people that can't afford £25 a day to go to work, let's say, to pay what they use.
Well, absolutely. I mean, I suppose coming on to, how do you deliver the technology? And by the way, the road user charging debate never ends with the answer, if only we had the technology for that. Because of course, technology exists today, and it has existed for an awful lot of time. It's having the political will, to deliver that, which is the great challenge. I suppose the great advantage of EVs is that they are principally far more connected. So yeah, I mean, Alex perhaps might talk a little bit more about this than I can, but we can connect into what we would call CITS in our industry, but we can connect into EVs in a far greater way than we perhaps could have done in a diesel car that's 15 years old. Again, what you see in London is you see an awful lot of infrastructure. We've all seen the cameras. We've seen quite a few have been cut down as well, unfortunately. But we see an awful lot of the infrastructure that we rely on to deliver that road user charging system. The great advantage with EVs is that a lot of that won't be needed in the future with the onset of connected vehicles, etc., as I've mentioned. You could take that to the nth degree, and you could say, well, actually, connected vehicles, you've already mentioned dynamic pricing. That might not be something that you change every 6 months. That might be something that you change every 15 minutes, dependent on traffic conditions. We're traffic guys as well. We know what the roads are doing. We know the congestion that's on those roads, and we could price for that, you see. So we could incentivize people to say, don't get in your car at 8 o'clock in the morning, get in it half an hour earlier, and it will halve the costs to use the road. And people will positively respond to that in a way. They will see that as I've saved myself half the cost of that, as opposed to it's double to go 8 o'clock in the morning. People just don't work like that. And we've seen that again in public transport, that behaviour. So I think it'll be really interesting, as environmental conditions, deteriorate, we can adapt pricing policy in real time. And that's when people will start to see the benefit, and they will start to appreciate that these things are A, having a positive effect, and B, are something that can be politically delivered. Alex, I don't know if you agree with any of that, but that's certainly how we see it from the tolling industry.
Alex,
Yeah,
what do you think?
Lots of things is what I think. I think that for in relation to that, I think this is the advantage of new technology coming in, is it potentially allows us to solve multiple challenges, multiple problems at the same time. As you said, these new vehicles, like everything, we're connecting things. The connections are faster, and we're better able to link in back-end systems as well. So you can do an awful lot more. A little bit like I was talking earlier about the ability to have my car charged at times at which there is an excess of renewables and prices are cheaper on the grid. That's only because it's a connected vehicle, right? And just to be clear, that's actually in this case, that's the car is directly connected to the energy supplier's back end rather than coming through any other system as well. So a little bit like Tim, you were saying there, actually we can, it's interesting you said it's a bit of a sort of a blunt tool is to charge to come in, whether you're in there for 1 minute into the ULEZ or you're in there for the best part of a day. It's a little bit like your you pay your road tax whether you drive 1 mile or 1 million miles, whereas actually we have that technology, and as you said, we've had when I was just starting to learn to drive, the black boxes were just starting to be talked about in terms of the tracking young drivers and those sorts of things. That telemetry has been there for a very long time. It's not so much a technology challenge. I do agree very much with Tim. This is a political challenge to do this, and it's the same as I think was with EVs. Once you suddenly had cars that had batteries that were more than 120, more than 150 miles of reliable real world range, the technology was there to suffice for an awful lot of population. But it took that political will to say, we're going to deliver a lot of charging infrastructure, and we're also then going to basically push the manufacturers to sell these vehicles as well. And I think EVs have got kind of almost the inverse challenge there with road user pricing. Is you can actually introduce that road user pricing in a very small area. You can target a city centre and introduce that, a bridge, and you can introduce that, and we have done that. We've had these schemes. The downside, as you said, is you've got to be careful you don't end up then creating an additional tax on a group of people that actually need to be providing support for. The flip for EVs is, as you said, they are more expensive, and hence what you've seen, most manufacturers have started with a higher priced vehicle, and as those volumes have started to increase, have added lower price categories, right? With that premium is gradually closing. The downside is you have to introduce this nationally to create that behavior change. It's very difficult to say, good news, we've covered one city in chargers, everyone could start buying EVs, because people drive in and out of that, people live there and work elsewhere, or live somewhere else and work there, and you have to start to have that confidence of coverage that if I do go to drive to see a family member who lives somewhere else, or I work in a different city, I need to know I've got charging at all ends of that. So I think they've got slightly different challenges, but I agree with your point there, Riley, is actually the introduction of this technology suddenly means we can do an awful lot more, solve multiple problems, congestion and decarbonisation of the vehicle park.
I mean, a really good start would be to change the wording here. We've talked about road tax and taxation and da. It would be really great if people didn't perceive it as a tax. It would be much better if people perceived it as paying for a service, because then they would get, I personally think, EVs create a huge opportunity for the government. Should I say the introduction? It is broadly accepted that they use the roads but pay virtually nothing by way of road tax and fuel duty, and people accept this. not only do people accept this that haven't got one, but people accept this who have got one, and they see, and ironically, they have as much impact on the road. They use the space as the road, and some would say that they have a greater impact on the durability of the road because of their weight than more traditional cars. So, for me, politically, it's a great opportunity for to introduce road user charging or pay as you drive or whatever you want to call it, exclusively for EVs, to say, oh no, so then you've got this soft start. You haven't got this, on the 31st of March we do it this way, and on the 1st of April we do it that way. You've got the opportunity politically to have this soft start to say, let's introduce road use charging or satellite-based tolling or whatever it might be for EVs, and that will be the slow migration that will recognise that EVs need to pay their way in the same as everybody else is doing. And so for me, it's not politically dangerous, and I know, Riley, you've got a much better handle on the political deliverability of these things than any of us have. But I don't know if you would agree with that. But for me, if the government are looking for a way to introduce this technology without upsetting too many people, focusing on EVs is a fantastic opportunity.
I appreciate both your honesty, actually, and practical steps in what can be changed pretty quickly. What I think I've lost by working between politicians and business is my own opinion sometimes. So it's always about where is the balance? Where is the balance? What could be the challenge of this and the challenge of that? I fully agree that if someone like Lilian Greenwood, or indeed one of the ministers in HMRC, talking about the UK, of course, and it's the same for Europe, has the desire to be transparent about things like, if you buy an EV vehicle, that's not only good for the environment, but also actually in the long run doesn't cost you as much as you think, because you're going to pay less in road charges. And you show people, as you both touched on, the business case for themselves and their family, and then the positive impact on the environment rather than going with a punishment might be a completely different story. I wonder, it wasn't something that I thought I'd ask you, but I wonder how much of this, because you talked about a lot of solutions. Normally in politics, you talk about problems and how difficult it is to resolve them. But it doesn't seem like this is the case in our little chat group here. Is this then a problem, all of what we're talking about, adaptation, understanding from a consumer perspective and government perspective, both in paying for a service in your case rather than tax, and then in Tim's case, that is, and in Alex's case, to be faster, then you've got to be fully committed and get more structured government support in this case, but also work with the consumers to understand the benefits of charging on one particular point of the day than another. Is this a story problem and a branding problem? I never thought I'd ask this question, but I'm just left with the feeling that maybe if we, from a government perspective, consumer perspective, not so much, but government perspective, business perspective, and then lobbying perspective, talk about what actually is the positive with numbers, that might help us and the environment at the same time. What do you think?
I think it is exactly that. It's the communication to create the behavioural change, and I do quite firmly believe actually we have the technology to solve most of our energy, our climate challenges. Where it's domestic heating. Like we've had insulation for some time. They seem to be strangely controversial, but heat pumps, domestic solar battery storage. There's cost challenges and how you finance these things. That's for sure. A lot of that is it's solved with scale, though, as well. And where you have demand, you will have those innovations in the financing for it as well. And I think the same is true, certainly from an EV perspective. We have the vehicles today, we have the charging capability today. People often talk about EVs being a stepping stone to hydrogen. I find it very, very difficult to see that occurring for cars and vans, possibly for some heavy goods vehicles, possibly for the trains. But probably everywhere you drive today has got electricity. And so unlike hydrogen, for example, and even they're actually an advantage over petrol and diesel, most places you drive won't have somewhere to refuel hydrogen, petrol or diesel. It will have somewhere to refuel your EV. The challenge becomes the last connection, the plug. And actually the bigger challenge though becomes persuading people, getting a nice clear message. And I think it a little bit come back to what you were saying there, Tim. So I have agreement with you in the approach is it's shifting the conversation. When EVs first started to come onto the scene, it was only purely around climate change was why you should use these, rather than actually what you now see is these vehicles are good vehicles. They're
better. Yeah.
Vehicles to drive. The fact that every day I leave my house, my car is charged. I don't have to worry about going. The only time I go to stop at a service station is because fed up with the kids screaming in the back. Now I need to get out the car for some peace and quiet.
Or a coffee.
Exactly. That's the point you stop for. And that's those things are positives that come into that. Not to mention the fact that actually, it supports, if you've got solar on your house, for example, you start to benefit from cheaper fuels as well. So yeah, I very much agree. We need to get better at communicating these messages to then create the behavioural changes that go with it.
Tim?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, the good news is when it comes to road user charging, we have almost blanket political agreement. The bad news is that the political agreement is that it's bad, with the exception of perhaps the Greens, who I know are very positive towards the ULEZ system in London. Yeah, it's very easy for our topic to be kicked into the long grass. But what I and perhaps we need to shift the conversation about well, there's two things I would say. First, let's be clear. This technology is revenue generating. Mm. This isn't something which costs you something to do. It's something that creates revenue. However you want to call that, whether you want to call it taxation or pay as a service, whatever it is on that principle. And secondly, and it's a little bit more challenging, a little bit like the air quality discussion we had earlier about, people can't feel it if it's bad, is, it stops the rot in terms of the reduction in the money that's coming in. The government made, quite rightly, a huge amount of hay around the 22 million black hole. Well, guess what? We peaked at 30 billion in fuel tax revenues. Mm. That is heading south in a pretty dramatic way. That will get down to where it's not particularly relevant pretty quickly. I mean, we see certain countries, and the one that springs to mind is Norway, is just accepting that. They've said, do you know what? We've looked at this. We're going to lose a load of money because of the falling fuel duty. We're okay with that. That's great for Norway. Perhaps we're not in that position. So we can see this as a way of filling that black hole, because guess what? By my maths, the 30 billion black hole that's going to be created here is bigger than the 22 that got an awful lot of political focus. So, I mean, from my side, I'm going to be participating at the Labour and the Conservative the conferences this year. The honest answer is I don't know what they think, and that's why I'm going. So we're going to have some good sort of panel stuff that we're going to be doing, which will hopefully give us more reflection and give us more idea of what we actually need, how we actually need to engage with the government and politics more widely, in order to shift this from being something which will pretty much guarantee to get you voted out, as shifting away from that towards what I genuinely believe it is, which is a force for good. The stuff that Alex is doing is a force for good. Look at the air quality in the 1970s compared to now. The stuff that we're doing, creating revenue to fund things that we all love, which, by the way, is the roads, is a force for good. It's a positive thing, as opposed to, oh my God, you monster. Because the real challenge we've got here is there's a general perception that the roads are free.
Yep. When you think about the This is very true. When you think about the industries that are necessary, and not talking about just healthcare and food in this case, but beyond the basic needs of a human being, transport and the roads are where we get our stuff from. So from logistics to moving to whatnot, it's everywhere. And it's not just road, it's also sea, and air, which we're not going to touch on here because that's going to be a very, very long conversation. But in in a way to wrap up, it sounds like, and it's probably true, that most politicians don't go into politics, and most decision makers, whether it's in the local council environment or not, don't go into politics with negative intentions. They go in wanting to change things, but what happens after that is that action is missing, because there is so much pressure on satisfying one segment of the population or another segment. I think that what we are all in agreement of, and please, if you're disagreeing with my summary, do tell me, is that we just require action with what's available at the moment, more flexibility and more agility in the sector of transport, specifically in EV charging, and paying for a service instead of road taxation. So I think that the transport industry is in a very good position to be able to be agile and more flexible than other industries, for example. But whether there is political willingness or not just depends on the leadership, and whether the decision makers are ready to choose the consequences of their decisions. Any thoughts on that, and any final thoughts on what's next for you, and what would you like realistically to happen in the next 6 months in your respective industries?
Well, I mean, I suppose the first thing I'll say is that I hope that I have a fabulous experience at the party conferences and come away completely energized and with lots of measurable action. I agree with the point you make is, let's make it real. Let's make it real, even if we do it in a small dippy or toe way. The technology exists. Lots of lessons learned right across Europe. We could take these guys to many locations that Capsh and other providers are working in, to say, look, that's how France are doing it, that's how Germany do it, that's how Bulgaria are doing it, whatever it might be, and just try and create an environment where it is perhaps a little bit more difficult for people to kick the can down the road, because it's always tomorrow's discussion, and that doesn't really, that just allows us to have a slow gradual decline, doesn't it? And that's not what we want, because as you said, these politicians, they want to enact positive change, and I think if we deliver it in the right way, certainly from my side, we can absolutely do that.
Thank you. Alex?
Yeah, I think the most important point from my perspective of what you said there is, and it's mentioned a few times here, is political will, and I think probably more importantly is the leadership of that. Because Tim, you said earlier that the difficult truth is that it has worked in terms of reducing congestion and improving air quality in London. EVs are now working with 1.5 million on the road in the UK, and I think you asked earlier, Riley, in terms of like the shift in the US and the change towards kind of obviously anti net zero. And I think what's interesting now is 5-6 years ago that would have been a real concern for the EV industry, and I don't want to pretend the job is done. There's a long way still to go, and we have to continue to keep momentum, keep pace. But actually, there is now momentum there. There is a critical mass that is starting to move through this, and I think that's the hard bit. Is there's some very clever people, very smart, innovative businesses creating these technologies, and I'm not underestimating the intellect and the capability and the drive to do that. This is fundamentally about changing people's behaviors and people's perceptions, and change requires leadership. And I think particularly, and you talk about this, is you often say people make, I mess this saying up now, let's not make perfect the enemy of the good. Is that right around?
Yeah.
And there is not a perfect solution, but that does not mean that what we have right now should not be implemented. And I think it's that staying power. And that, I think, is the biggest thing, where you see those countries like Norway who've gone to do this. And we're seeing now, I think, in the EV space in the UK, is it took political will to introduce the ZEV mandate, support it with funding. and then stay the course, ignore the challenges and the frustrations, and these cars are going to catch fire and run out of charge, and all the lights are going to turn off. They haven't. It's still working, and we've still got progress momentum. I think that's the biggest thing is the leadership. It's the strength.
One of the things that just to add to that, I'm pretty sure economic growth is right up there with their objectives. Can there be any more quick win? Bang for your buck, all of those cliches that you can come out with. Investing in transportation in this way is a quick win for economic growth, surely. And if we were to introduce even a quarter of the things that we've discussed today, you would see that, surely.
Yeah, I think that's a good place to stop. If there is anything very interesting that you want to share from a development perspective in your industries, that is, whether it's technology or something else, please do. If not, I think the message is, let's act, know what the consequences are and be ready for them. And also, let's not ignore each and every one of us and our own understanding of the benefits of the transportation sector, in particular, the EV sector and road usage, and what it means for us individually, for our local community and local councils. Maybe we should have invited a comms specialist on this call to tell us how to go about it. But I think that in your individual businesses as well, you have a lot of touch points with your customers that are not just individuals, but also businesses and local councils. Maybe a request from me is, don't forget that you also have a role to play in informing your stakeholders about why these changes are positive for the economy, Tim, and also for the environment, Alex. Anything you'd like to add at the end?
No, I don't want to talk about technology, because we've already agreed it's not about technology, because it already exists.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, both.
Thank you.
Nice to see you. Thank you.
Nice
Bye-bye.